Welcome to Yellow Table Talk, a podcast for women professionals interested in climate change. No climate experience necessary. My name is Michelle Lee, and I'm the co-founder of Women in Climate. My background is in software sales, and I've worked for some of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley and pivoted into climate in 2021. Together with my co-founder Stephanie Corbally, we have created one of the largest virtual and in-person communities for women interested in climate change, with over 7,000 members in our Slack channel and active members across Asia, Middle East, Africa, North America, South America, and Europe. Head over to our website to learn more, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Today, I'm here with Gina Panayiotou, who's originally from Cyprus but is now based in London. Gina is an expert in maritime decarbonization, and I'm excited to unpack the topic with Gina today. Make sure you stay to the end where we talk about women in maritime. Welcome to YTT, Gina.
It's fantastic to be here, Michelle. Thanks so much for the invite. So excited for you guys with the Yellow Table Talk, and very much looking forward to our discussion, and especially that last bit on women in maritime.
Yes. Okay, so we like to open with what beverage we're having at the Yellow Table today. Gina, what are you going to be enjoying?
Well, mine is coffee. That's my go-to beverage usually. So yeah, coffee's on my table, and it's actually in a yellow mug too, just to be on brand.
I love that. Okay, well, tell me a little bit more about your coffee. Like, how do you take it? Is it an Americano? Is it espresso?
Yeah, usually it's an Americano, quite strong, to be fair, and black, no cream, no sugar. So yeah.
Nice. I am also enjoying a coffee. It's morning here in Toronto, and I normally like to do pour over, but I've recently gotten into just doing like a really casual French press, like no press at all. I just use kind of like an empty jar and put the coffee bits in the bottom and strain it, but I like that it's stronger than a pour over. So we're going to be having coffee together today.
Fantastic. Sounds great.
So Gina, let's open up by having you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a maritime lawyer. That's how I kind of started off my career and turned into a strategist, I guess, for the industry. I was always more focused on environmental law and compliance, and naturally transitioned into ESG, which is, of course, environmental, social, and governance. Now I run my own consultancy called Oceans Arena, where what we do basically, I work with different maritime companies and stakeholders to create their impact strategies that really, one, illuminates their brand, sets them apart, but also creates a better world for all. And I think we're going to talk about a bit more about that in the discussion today.
Awesome. It's not every day that you run into a maritime lawyer, so we're very, very happy to have you, Gina. So for those that are completely new to the maritime space, can you tell us a little bit about it? Who are some of the key stakeholders? Why should our community know and learn about this industry?
This question always gets me very excited when I'm talking to people outside the industry, because I get to share how amazing it is, which was my first experiences of it. I mean, I'm going to share 4 goods and 1 bad. The good parts, the interesting parts about it is that for those who don't know, 90% of global trade comes by sea, actually. So even the coffee that we're having today, mine is probably from somewhere, shipped from somewhere, Colombia or Peru. Everything more or less around us comes by a ship. So it's basically the industry that moves the world around. And even though it gets a bad rep, it is one of the most environmentally friendly means of transport. And in fact, it's a big part of our post-decarbonization strategy. They switched to shipping more or less everything, and that reduced the carbon footprint by 95%. So even though it is a contributor, obviously, as a carbon emitter, it is one of the most environmentally friendly means of transport. The other thing I'll say, it's one of the most highly regulated industries in the world. So we have regulations and conventions which range up to 50 different kind of international instruments. They regulate things from safety to ocean health. Another interesting fact about it is that this year in April, the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, that's the main UN regulatory body for maritime, passed the first ever global carbon pricing for shipping, which was quite a unique thing to happen. It's a very fascinating and multifaceted industry. The one thing is that it's one of the most male-dominated industries in the world. The recent study amounted to like 16% of the workforce being women. In C-suite, it's even less. And when it comes to ships, it's around like 1%, which is quite shockingly low figure, as you can appreciate. You also asked on the stakeholders, so just very quickly on that, you've got people like the ship owners, of course, and the operators. These are the people who either own, or manage the ship. Then you've got the charterers, who are the people who would rent it out to carry the goods from A to B. You've got regulatory bodies, of course. I mentioned the IMO, which is actually the only UN body headquartered in London, which makes regulations in respect to shipping internationally. And then you've got other players like insurance and legal and financing, port operators, of course, the flag of the vessel, which is quite an interesting concept because every vessel has to be regulated by some kind of country's legislation. So they pick a flag. It's a bit more complex than that, but I won't go into details. And we're also seeing a very obviously up and coming emerging startup ecosystem, which is great and why I'm really so passionate about the work that I do, because being so multi-stakeholder as an industry and so global, it can really have a big impact on climate change and generally.
That is such a fantastic overview of the sector, Gina. Your 4 goods and 1 bad was really, really on point, and also the different stakeholders. I hadn't really thought of some of them before either. And you mentioned, 90% of global trade. I've seen figures where they're quoting like 98%, 99% of things that are shipped that we buy on a regular basis go through the ocean. So it's definitely high and up in the 90s. And I think most people are pretty surprised by that. And one thing I also didn't really know is that it's a very highly regulated industry. For what I know about the industry, I would have almost thought the opposite. Because, high speeds result in things like maritime collisions with organisms like whales and illegal fishing, etc. But it is good to know that it actually is a highly regulated industry. The carbon pricing piece is very interesting as well. And we'll definitely unpack the presence of women in the field. So let's get into the topic a little bit more. When it comes to challenges or headwinds that the industry is facing right now, can you highlight what those are, Gina?
Yeah, I think I'd have to say I'll put them under 3 things. The first is obviously, without doubt, the decarbonization of this industry. While, of course, it is very highly regulated, and you're right, the perception of it is very different. But a fun fact there is that the first kind of regulation came after the Titanic, a couple of years later. So it is highly regulated. But the problem that we have is that it's so diverse. Like there's so many vessels out there, and this means that from their age, the way they're built, there's so much diversity in the fleet that it's a huge challenge to find a solution that's going to fit all or most of them. This is a UN body that regulates it, right? So you've got 175 member states with different agendas and stuff. So it becomes quite challenging to create certainty around that. There's also things like geopolitical tensions, and I won't go too much into it, but probably a lot of people may have seen in the news ships being attacked by terrorists with the Red Sea crisis, of course. So that unfortunately derails a bit from the decarbonization focus, because you've got these owners and operators who now need to worry about what route to pick to make sure the vessel is safe, the environment is safe, the crew is safe. So that's a big challenge when it comes to decarbonizing the industry. And also a quick thing there to add is that you're also looking at assets that, if a vessel is 10 years old, it's going to be operating in the sea for the next 20, 30 years. So you need to figure out a solution that works for existing fleet. And then if you're looking to build something new, you also need to figure out what's going to work out as an investment for the next 40 years. So huge challenge there. The second challenge that I preach about literally every table that you put me on, I'll say this. We're so worried about, the fuel of the future. But for me, the fuel of the future is its talent. And in shipping, we've got a big problem, I would say, on talent attraction retention. For one, I shared already the numbers of women in shipping, and that's, 50% of talent being untapped. And then we've got also this image problem. So people don't even know about the opportunities out there. I didn't even know, facts, 90% of what comes to us comes from a ship. Even when I did, this is quite funny, whenever I say it, people don't believe me, but I did my Maritime Masters in law. But unless you step into a ship owner's office and you see, that the first time I saw that interactive map of how many ships are around the world and what they're carrying, it doesn't sink in what exactly this industry does. It really is the industry that moves the world around. But people, the young generation, they don't quite know it. We're not as sexy as, tech and AI and space or whatever. So they're not really keen to work for this industry. In fact, quite the opposite, because we have this bad reputation. It's also, them seeing us as an industry that pollutes the oceans, which is quite the opposite. So yeah, the second one for me is definitely talent. And the last big problem is, of course, being so global. You're looking at a just transition here, which is a big challenge again, because obviously different states, the least developing countries and the small island nations that need to all be aligned, the whole world needs to be aligned, because the ship will call ports globally, right? And do they have the infrastructure to support this process of decarbonization or global goals? So a few things there. And also I would maybe throw in the lack of incentives. And when I say that, for example, we do have the tech in place to decarbonize or try out solutions, but then you've got these early adopters who are not only not incentivized, they're penalized for wanting to try them on, because to an insurer, that's a new risk, right? So it means the premium goes up instead of down, even though the owner is trying to do the right thing. So quite a few things there, I would say, like decarbonization, talent, the kind of just transition phase and incentives, a few headwinds there to tackle.
Yeah, just to name a few of the big ones. In the maritime space, there's just this whole new vocabulary, vessel, fleet, call ports. It's really interesting. I mean, I'm not in this space myself, but I have dipped my toes in and I know a little bit of the language, but I'm excited to dive into the vocabulary towards the end there. But Gina, let's kind of roll it back a little bit and talk about what are the main levers to decarbonize the maritime industry, right? I've read figures that it's about 2% of global emissions, 2%, 3%. What are some of those top 3-ish levers?
So some of the things that obviously are on the table are looking at alternative fuels, which is a big discussion, I think, in quite a few industries beyond shipping. But then you're also looking at things like tech and optimizing existing fleets. The reason I mentioned the challenge earlier of the diversity of the fleet, because you're not just looking at what you're going to build. There are existing vessels sailing and navigating in the oceans at the moment. So you need to look at how to also optimize their decarbonization, right? So when it comes to alternative fuels, obviously, I'm not an expert, but I've been, I think, in enough conferences and discussions to kind of know that you're looking at things like LNG and methanol, biofuels, ammonia, hydrogen. Then you're also looking at other energy sources like electrification or wind energy is picking up a lot in the industry, especially for existing vessels. So there's wind turbines that you can put as cells, I guess, on the vessels, and that can reduce their emissions by 40%, which is quite incredible.
Wow.
And you're also looking at other smaller things that can be done on existing fleets. So things like managing the biofouling, which means that the vessel can run more efficiently, burn less fuel, or things like just-in-time arrivals, which is, quite a maritime term, but basically what it means, instead of idling outside a port and emitting, you arrive more or less at the time that you're going to load or unload your vessel. I think I would say at the moment we're still seeing LNG as the most widely adopted fuel, I would say. Even though it's a fossil fuel, of course, it does emit less CO2. And obviously, all of the fuels that I mentioned come with considerations. We're also seeing dual engines, so either existing fleets being retrofitted with 2 engines to accommodate both options, because you need to also look at the risks there. As I mentioned, there's, the risk of handling this kind of new fuels, the technical issues there. Maybe some trends, I guess, may be helpful. So like a big player like Maersk, most people may have probably heard of them or seen a vessel in the oceans. So what they're doing, they're ordering green methanol fueled ships, or others like MSC are sticking with LNG. If anybody's really interested, in these fuels, the IMO does have on their website an alternative fuel use kind of regulatory status map, which is useful. Or I'll also mention some of the class societies like Lloyd's Register or DNV. They really have, a deep dive into pros and cons of every fuel. But I think the important thing that I need to say here, and I always try to make this point, is that we also need to think, when you're taking into consideration these pros and cons, is to understand if the alternative fuels and tech is available in the ecosystem and infrastructure to support global shipping. And a very good example is the cruise industry. So a big part of cruises, obviously, if they've got their engine on while they are at ports, and I'm really simplifying this so people can really understand. Obviously, they're emitting much more emissions, and it's been a huge problem in communities who have tried, who protest about it. So the cruise industry has really worked hard to be able to plug in at a port to use electricity, basically, and that actually reduces their emission by 98%. It's quite impressive, and around 90% of the cruise fleet will be able to do that by 2026. But the problem is, do all of the ports around the world that they call have the facility and the infrastructure to accommodate this? And the answer is no. So it's a bigger challenge than just, looking at the fuels and the kind of options there. But there are a lot of options. And as I mentioned, it's things like alternative fuels, optimizing the existing operations of the vessels, and obviously a lot of tech and innovation and ideas there, but also the financing to look at that challenge that I mentioned earlier of a just transition globally, because this is a global industry. You can't just fix one part of the world.
I mean, so much to unpack in what you just shared there, Gina. And everyone's always really interested in alternative fuels. I think SAF is one of the most known acronyms in the climate space as well. And there's a lot of talk about airlines adopting new fuels, cleaner fuels. In a little bit of the work that I've done, I've learned that, the airline industry actually does take up a lot of those clean fuels, and the maritime industry is really sort of razor thin margins. So it's super cost sensitive. And some of these fuels just financially don't even make sense, let alone the insurance piece, where an innovative company might be penalized at first for trying something new. So there's all these different types of push and pull, headwinds and tailwinds. But hopefully, as an industry working together, we'll eventually get there. And, clean propulsion, whether it's the wind, seeing these really cool sort of blades that vessels can be retrofitted that could also help direct the wind, et cetera. So there's definitely a lot of innovation in the space, would you say?
Yeah, there is. And I think one of the things that I said earlier on the stakeholders, we're seeing this big movement of startup hubs and innovators and accelerators, which is fantastic because it touches upon the talent point, which I'm very concerned about personally. And I think it's given room for people to come into this industry and for women also, to contribute more meaningfully. So there are opportunities there always. In a crisis, there's always opportunities. But it's great to see that to solve these solutions, ecosystems are created to support these challenges, which is great. I'm glad you mentioned SAF actually, because maybe a quick note here just to give a bit of perspective. So the thing with maritime and what I try to highlight in discussions, and obviously aviation isn't my field, but with aviation, you do have, more fixed routes, and the type of aircrafts in the world can probably be measured if people sat down and saw how many they are. But with maritime, it's much more complicated to do, both see how many types of vessels are out there, but also the routes that they follow. So, yeah, I think that's where it gets a bit more complicated for the shipping industry. And the cost that you mentioned, of course, it's a big challenge. On top of insurances and everything else that we discussed, the one big thing is also having trained people to deal with this fuels and new tech, etc. So a lot of considerations there in this journey.
Yeah, a lot. And back to just one more point on the fuels piece, you did mention LNG a few times. And again, we're going to have a little vocabulary section towards the end, but LNG, will you tell us what that stands for?
Liquefied natural gas. Yeah, that's just what it stands for. And as I said, it is a fossil fuel, of course. We're not saying it's not. And I'm not a fuel expert, so I can't really dig in deep on how it works. But the way it burns, basically, it emits less CO2.
Right. Yeah. It's a better alternative, right?
Technically, there's a big debate over it. And I guess there's people that could argue this for hours. And there's people who actually protest and say it's not. And in fact, there was a position paper at the IMO, the previous Marine Protection Environment meeting, where a lot of states and NGOs were protesting against it and saying that it shouldn't be considered as an alternative fuel. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's probably not my place to really go in depth on it.
Well, I think there's always some homework for our listeners if they want to learn more, so they can dig into it and do their own investigation. Gina, before we move on to women representation, can you quickly touch on some of the tailwinds and opportunities right now when it comes to maritime decarbonization?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as I said, there's always opportunities in periods of challenges and crisis. The big one, which we already briefly touched upon, is because it's such a transformational change and we're seeing regulatory pressures and stakeholder pressures, it has created fertile ground for an ecosystem and room for startups, entrepreneurship to bring solutions into the sector. And that's kind of new for this industry, which is, quite traditional and had very conservative and traditional stakeholders. So this is something that we're seeing, I think, as an opportunity for a lot of people to tap into. Then I'd also say it's also a phenomenal time for the industry to reset its narrative. And that's a big part of also what we do at Oceans Arena and why I'm quite passionate. As I said, it does have an issue with emissions, of course, and the industry is working towards it. But a big problem is also the story that people know, and that affects the talent that we attract, the discussions that we have at lobbying tables, etc. So I think it's a really good time to reset that narrative and explain to people that it is highly regulated, it is the industry that moves the world around, it is the most environmentally friendly means of seaborne trade. In fact, there are some downloadables available also on my website on, setting the narrative. So that's a big opportunity for us. I think the last one is probably its global outreach. So what I like to say is that having so many stakeholders all around the world, if the shipping industry gets ESG and social impact right, it can really have a huge effect in the world. So yeah, I think those are the opportunities there that we really need to tap into.
Awesome. Where can our listeners go to find more information on your website?
So my website is oceans-arena.com. So they can find more information there.
Perfect. So this leads us to a topic I know you're really passionate about, which is the gender lens on the maritime sector, specifically, having women representation in the maritime workforce. Can you just kind of unpack that for us? What is it now? Like, why has it been so little? Like no surprise there, and why women should actually consider this as an exciting opportunity.
So when I entered this industry 12 years ago, it was even worse, I swear. And I have pictures it's probably the only place where you're going to see in maritime conferences a queue in the men's toilets rather than the women's toilets. So it's quite amusing to observe, but it has changed. I'm part of a board called Women's International Shipping and Trading Association, WISTA. It's an international NGO, been running for 50 years. And it ran a study with the IMO this year and 2 years ago. And that study showed that we're around 16% of women in the workforce of maritime, much lower in C-suite, and only 1% on board, which is really a very shockingly low number. And I think this happens a lot because obviously we've got the perception on what the industry is and what the profession looks like. There's a lack of awareness on the career options. You've got company cultures, which, as I said, are quite conservative. So you lack things like proper flexibility. You won't see a role in the maritime industry that's advertised as role sharing, for example, which, could have a big impact in that. There's also no clear acceleration career paths for women, both, in offices, but also on board, especially when they work on board, if they want to, have a family and go back at ship. In some places, I won't mention the countries for obvious reasons, but they won't even let them go back on board once they've had their first child. Wow. So there's a lot of things there. And then you've got the more harsh reality when we're talking about ships of, sexual harassment and bullying that happens on board vessels. So there's a lot of efforts being made now to kind of tackle that on a regulatory basis. But I also feel there's also a lack of role models and kind of support networks and the proper male allyship or male training, I guess, to understand unconscious bias. So I think those are kind of the barriers that have caused the situation that we're seeing. But on a very positive note, there has been huge efforts being made, especially over the past few years. And in fact, the current Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, Arsenio Dominguez, he pledged in his commitments to put diversity on top of his list. And he's actually refused to sit in panels where it has all been males. He actively takes a stand of it. And even his directorship team, he now has 3 out of 7 directors being female. So I think these kind of things are setting a really good example. And obviously through the work we do through Vista, we're in 62 countries now. I think around 6,000 members globally. So creating those role models, changing the perceptions. But I do feel there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in company cultures to be able to boldly, tackle this issue, because it's not going to just happen organically or naturally.
Maybe we need to create a little channel in our Slack group for Women in Climate for women in maritime.
Yeah, that would be great, actually.
And it's really fantastic to know that leaders like Arsenio Dominguez are really taking a stance and being a leader and supporting women. I think that's really fantastic. So thank you for sharing that, Gina. What is some helpful vocabulary to have in your back pocket if you're working in the maritime sector? There's so many phrases, acronyms. Give us a couple. So if we're ever in a room that's covering the maritime industry, we kind of know what's going on.
Yeah, this is kind of a big challenging one. Obviously, we've got, when it comes to contractual stuff, you've got something called the Incoterms. I won't go into detail, but if people are interested, they can look them up. And it's like how many dozens of acronyms that are being used in the industry. But generally, day-to-day kind of lingo, I think it comes in 3 categories. So you've got the kind of locational ones, then directional ones, and then the vessel components. So location ones, I think, is like saying the bow of the vessel, which is the front of the vessel. Or big ones are saying starboard. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's basically a bit navigational. You're saying you're going towards the right side. Or if you say port side, you're going to the left side. And then vessel components, things like the deck, for example, which is the whole horizontal platform that covers the floor of the vessel, or its hull, which is the body underneath. And yeah, bringing it maybe back to the climate discussion, anything that got on its hull that's below the waterline is what I mentioned earlier, subject to biofouling, of course. So yeah, those are kind of terms that you may hear being flaunted around at different maritime conversations.
Every time I'm in a maritime panel, I'm learning all this new lingo, like, as you mentioned before, calling ports. And yeah, I feel like I had learned some of these terms like starboard and portside. I don't even know when. I think maybe like when I was really young in school, but it's good to have a little bit of that language now. And even things like IMO and LNG, which we covered already. IMO, the International Maritime Organization, LNG, liquefied natural gas, etc., things like propulsion, really, really kind of key terms to know when you're in the industry. And I just want to make a little plug. The maritime sector does really important work shipping things from one place to another, and it's how we have everything that we have. But at the same time, just being cognizant of things like, for example, maritime collisions, which I mentioned earlier, where, you know, ships that are going at a really fast speed collide with marine organisms and can seriously injure and kill organisms like whales that have so much value in the environment. So, you know, even though the space is highly regulated, there's still some work to be done. And things like invasive species. So when you have water in the vessel to kind of balance it, and you're at another port and you release that water, a lot of the times there's invasive species that also inevitably will take home in the new area. And those are some issues as well that cause ecosystem changes and damages to different sort of ports and coastal cities around the world. So, you know, just want to put that in the space as well, because I think there's always responsible business that can be done. And those are certainly areas of some focus.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case with any industry, really. If you're doing a significant function for the world in carrying global trade around the world, it does come with a lot of challenges like this or problems like this. And again, I really feel there is phenomenal work being done from the IMO side, and all of this issues that you mentioned, like protected areas and injuring species and invasive species, etc. All of these do come to the table at the Marine Environment Protection Committees. So if anybody is really, you know, interested to dive in more on all of these segments, there's reports that come out after every MEPC. That's the abbreviation of the Marine Environment Protection Committee. So you can see, you know, which are defined as marine protected areas, or what's happening with underwater noise or invasive species. So there is a lot of work going on in the background, but obviously, you know, you need stakeholders and voices on board which can help understand the oceans better. And also quite proud to be a part of the philanthropy group of the National Oceanography Center. So, you know, players like this who help the industry also understand the ocean better. It's a work in progress. There's always a lot that needs to be done. But I do feel that at least we are on quite a good awareness level, and a lot of steps are already being taken forward. But of course, they do move really slow. I did say earlier, you're looking at 175 countries trying to agree on something, right? So everybody has a very different take on it.
Yeah. And you mentioned another topic that I forgot to mention, which is the noise pollution from the vessels, which can be very detrimental to how marine organisms communicate with each other or don't communicate as a result. So thanks for bringing that up as well. And yeah, with any industry, especially one so big as maritime, there's definitely going to be some challenges and areas of opportunity. So I think highlighting them is one step, and having these different regulators, boards to make decisions will be great. Gina, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. I want to switch gears to our real talk segment of Yellow Table Talk. All careers and professions have their ups and downs. Do you have a win, a challenge, a story, etc., that has recently or is currently playing out in your personal or professional life that you'd like to put in this space and share with our listeners?
Yeah, a challenge obviously that I've faced quite a bit in my career was being so male dominated. You do come across perceptions and people having assumptions on where you want to be and what you want to do, etc. And a funny story that I always share, which of course wasn't so funny at the time and quite demotivating actually, was when I started my first kind of role after a few years. I wanted to evolve more into a commercial kind of role. And I was actually told, but you're a woman, you can't really, be in commercial operations because the best deals happen at strip clubs and you can't take the clients to strip clubs. So things like this are quite, fascinating when you hear them, and especially starting out as a young professional in the industry. And I've had quite a few of these remarks along the way. But I think on the upside of this, I guess it does help you work a lot on your own mindset and moving forward. And it took me a while to realize, that being ambitious and stuff isn't a disease, as they like you to believe, and question why would you be seeking out more if you've already got a certain job, etc. So I guess that's what made me quite passionate also about supporting and empowering women in this industry, because I think it's important for our mindset to be in place. I think that's one of the main challenges that I've kind of seen in my professional career. The fact that it is so male dominated does sometimes create some issues there and challenges. But on the other hand, I have had fantastic male allies along the way. So yeah, no complaints in that respect. I can't say that's the only problem, of course. And then the other thing that I would say is quite unique about it is, as I mentioned, it was quite a conservative industry where the owners are big ship-owning families. So usually it's family business. So coming in as nobody who has no family ties with the industry whatsoever, let alone creating their own business along the way, it's quite an interesting journey. But from my conversation, I said now there's a lot of fertile ground for startups, etc. So things have definitely improved along the way.
Yeah, wow. I have worked in some male-dominated industries myself. Tech is infamously one of those, but I don't think that those remarks would ever be made in the tech industry. So it's quite eye-opening. But I think with organizations like Wista, we're going to move towards a different future, especially with leaders like the one we have right now with the IMO. It sounds like that's hopefully going to be a thing of the past. Gina, thank you so much for joining us today. Gina is a member of the Women in Climate Speaker Database and is available to speak at events, so make sure to keep her in mind for any future events that you might have. Gina, thank you so much for your time today. And for our listeners, stay tuned for our next episode in season 1 of YTT.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Head over to www.womenandclimate.co to learn more about how to join and support our free community. And be sure to subscribe to Yellow Table Talk wherever you get your podcasts. Stay tuned for the next episode.